Okay, Tumtum and Nutmeg, Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall. You can tell this book is well loved, has been well read. Many, many kids in my class have read this. Our family has read this. I've read this out loud many years. It's a favorite. Um, it is about Tumtum and Nutmeg. So you can see Tumtum is down there under the sink repairing some eyeglasses. Nutmeg is up there on the wardrobe polishing a mirror. That's the first picture. Chapter 1. Once there were two married mice called Mr. and Mrs. Nutmouse, and they lived in great style. They had a big rambling house with a ballroom and a billiards room and a banqueting room and a butler's pantry and just about every other sort of room a married couple might want. There were 36 rooms in all. Think how many rooms are in your house. I doubt you have 36. Maybe, but whew. The house was called Nutmouse Hall, and it was situated in a broom cupboard of a small human dwelling called Rose Cottage. A broom cupboard might not sound like a very grand place for a house, but this broom cupboard was special. It had creamy white walls, mottled red tiles on the floor, and a tiny window hidden behind a curtain of honeysuckle. But the nicest thing of all about the broom cupboard was that no human knew it was there. This was because a very long time ago, soon after Rose Cottage was built, someone pushed a big dresser against the kitchen wall, hiding the broom cupboard door from view. The dresser always stayed there because there was nowhere else to put it. It was Mr. Nutmouse's great-great-great-grandfather who first discovered the broom cupboard when he crept underneath the dresser and poked his nose under the door. The red tiles and the white walls looked so appealing that he decided to build a house there straight away. And the first thing he had to do was to build a big round mouse hole so that his workmen could get in and out with all their bricks and cement mixers. And then he fitted the mouse hole with smart iron gates, and soon as a mouse entered those gates, he was on the Nutmouse family's territory. Nutmouse Hall was built in the middle of the broom cupboard, and it was considered a very fine piece of architecture. The walls were made of pretty pebblestone, and there were gables on the windows and little turrets peeking out of the roof. You know what a turret is? Like kind of like a usually round part that goes up, like if you think of a castle and parts that stick up and have a little pointed cone roof, that might be a turret. So this house has turrets. The front of the house faced south, so the bedroom windows caught the sun as it filtered through the honeysuckle. The smallest rooms, such as the bathrooms, were the size of a cake tin, while the ballroom was the size of a hamper. And a hamper-sized room seemed very big to the Nutmouses since they were only 2 inches tall. Because Nutmouse Hall was so enormous, Mr. and Mrs. Nutmouse did not use all the rooms available to them. Mr. Nutmouse spent most of the time in his library warming his toes in front of the fire, and Mrs. Nutmouse spent most of her time scurrying about in her kitchen making delicious things to eat. Mr. and Mrs. Nutmouse had been married a long time, but they still called each other by the affectionate pet names they had adopted during their engagement. Mrs. Nutmouse called Mr. Nutmouse Tumtum because he had such a large one. And Tumtum called Mrs. Nutmouse Nutmeg because she had nutmeg hair. Tumtum thought this was very exotic because his family had been all grays. In their funny way, the Nutmouses were very well suited to each other. Tumtum was a wise, bookish sort of mouse. He never lost his temper or got agitated, and he did everything very calmly and slowly. Nutmeg was quite the opposite. She did things 19 to the dozen, and even little tasks like putting icing on a cake could get her into a terrible dither. But in her hasty way, she was surprisingly efficient. The house was spick and span, the bills were paid on time, and the food served at Nutmouse Hall was the envy of all mice for miles around. So she likes to cook and bake, and Tumtum likes to eat, which works out well. Tumtum looked upon every meal as a celebration. For breakfast, there would be eggs and bacon and toast and marmalade. Lunch was all manner of cold meats and salads. For afternoon tea, there was always a homemade cake or scone, and supper would be a delicacy, such as earwigs. Nutmeg had a whole shelf of cookbooks, so she was never short of inspiration. Tumtum was not as rich as his ancestors had been, and this was because he gave most of his money away. He supported all sorts of charities for homeless mice, charities for arthritic mice, charities for illiterate mice, charities for bald mice. He even supported a charity for mice with hiccups. So one way or another, the Nutmouses did not have much money left. They did not employ a butler or a maid, and they could not afford to give banquets in their banqueting hall room, nor balls in their ballroom. But since neither of them much liked balls and banquets, they didn't mind a bit. Nutmeg was such a good housekeeper that life was splendid all the time. But beyond the broom cupboard where the humans lived, things were not splendid at all. Rose Cottage was owned by Mr. Mildew, a widower who lived there with his 2 children, Arthur and Lucy. They did not have very much money, and they did not have nearly so many rooms as the Nutmouses had. There was one bathroom, which was only a little bit bigger than the bath, and Arthur and Lucy shared a tiny bedroom in the attic with a ceiling that leaked. From the outside, Rose Cottage looked very inviting. The garden was full of pear trees and wildflowers, and the honeysuckle trailed all over the stone walls and curled along the fat fringe of the thatch. But inside was less agreeable. Every room was rife with clutter and chaos. The walls were damp, and the plaster was beginning to crumble. The beams in the living room were full of woodworms, and the carpets were so threadbare that you could see through to the floorboards, which were full of woodworms too. The boiler, that's like the source of heat for the house, it had packed up long ago, and in winter the wind howled into the kitchen through the cracks in the garden door. It's making me have a text-to-text connection with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. If you've ever read that book, Charlie's house is kind of cold like this house. They have a hard time keeping it warm. The cottage had been much better cared for when Mrs. Mildew was alive, but she had died long ago when Arthur was still a baby. He couldn't remember his mother at all, and Lucy could only remember her being a little bit sad. The Mildew children did not miss having a mother because they couldn't remember what having one had been like, and yet they knew there were certain disadvantages to being without one, and they considered living in chaos to be among them. Remember I said there was a little bit of chaos in this book too. But Mr. Mildew was such a head-in-the-clouds sort of fellow that he hardly seemed to notice the bad situation in Rose Cottage. He was an inventor by trade, and he spent all of his time crashing about in his tiny study upstairs, trying to invent things. Years ago, he had invented a gadget for peeling grapes, which had been sold in a department store in London and had made him quite rich for a short time. These mice and these children live in England. So this book is set in England, and some of the words are a little bit different because the way people speak English in England is sometimes different than the way people speak English in the United States. So people weren't buying his grape peelers anymore, so now he needed to invent something else. And as a result, he didn't think nearly as hard as he might about the housekeeping, which was why Rose Cottage was such a mess. It was all he could do to put meals on the table, and he was so absent-minded that he could never remember which meal was which. So as often as not, Arthur and Lucy found themselves eating canned spaghetti for breakfast and porridge for supper. The Mildews all looked rather scruffy, for they had never had new haircuts nor new clothes, but there was something distinguished about them too. Lucy was tall and graceful, and she had hair the color of copper, and Arthur had blue eyes and thick black hair. And he wore glasses with a broken frame, which kept slipping off his nose. Mr. Mildew was the most striking of all. He was always dressed in a purple jacket, which was falling to bits, and he had wiry hair which stuck out of his head like insect antennae. Less imaginative children might have been embarrassed by Mr. Mildew, but Arthur and Lucy felt very proud of him because he was much more interesting and exotic than anyone else's father. And he had plenty of good points. He hardly ever lost his temper, and he never nagged them to do boring things like cleaning their teeth or brushing their hair or tidying their room or doing their homework. But it wasn't easy living with someone so absent-minded. And now and again, they did feel a little bit neglected. And at the time this story begins, they had reason to feel even more neglected than usual. It was the middle of a long and icy winter. They had known weeks and weeks of the sort of biting weather that makes it painful to be outdoors. No one could remember the village being as cold as this. The duck pond was frozen to its depths. The gargoyles on the church were dribbling icicles, and all the school water pipes had frozen solid. One night, 2 of them burst. This was great drama, and it meant that the school had to be closed for 7 whole weeks while something called essential renovations took place. Most of the children were overjoyed about this, for it's not every year that one's Christmas vacation is extended into February. But Arthur and Lucy weren't so pleased, for if you have a father who gives you canned spaghetti for breakfast, and you live in a cottage so cold that the butter freezes in the kitchen, then the prospect of being stuck at home all winter long is not especially appealing. Had they known that there were mice living such gracious lives in their broom cupboard, they might have felt quite envious, jealous, right? They might have even wished that they were mice themselves, so that they could move into Nutmouse Hall and live as the Nutmouses did. And had the Nutmouses been different, they might have turned up their noses at the Mildews and felt quite superior. But Tumtum and Nutmeg did not feel superior at all. In fact, they felt rather uncomfortable. They were kind-hearted mice, and they did not think it right that they should be eating sumptuous meals in a warm house while the Mildew children ate horrid gloop out of cans in their icy kitchen. The Nutmouses had been concerned about Arthur and Lucy for some time, and the colder the winter became, the more their concern grew. And there comes a point at which concern grows so big that something has to be done about it. So in chapter 2, here's the first picture. In chapter 2, we get to see what they start to do about this situation. These two mice, Tumtum and Nutmeg.